Tonight, Mark Carney's big bet on fast-tracking big projects.
The first principle of these projects is it's in the interests of Canada.
Imagine a night when millions of people are asleep, cities are silent, and the fate of nations is being decided on a mobile phone screen. Somewhere between Washington and Ottawa, a dialogue begins that no one was supposed to see. On one side is a leader accustomed to receiving instant answers, capable of changing the course of negotiations with a single phrase or phone call. On the other is a man who has built his entire career on calmness and calculation, where emotions are irrelevant and decisions are made only after careful analysis. This was not just a phone call or an exchange of messages. It was a battle between two approaches to power: personal charisma and institutional restraint. The leader, accustomed to exerting pressure, sends messages to personal phones at 3 or 4 in the morning, writes in capital letters, threatens tariffs, and demands immediate decisions. But on the other side, there is silence. Not a single response, not a hint of concession, not a sign of weakness. Hidden in this silence was a strategy that no one could guess. Between these nighttime messages and public statements, something was happening that the world had never seen before. Dozens of scenarios were modeled behind closed doors, and the consequences of every phrase and every tweet were evaluated. The financial markets in New York expected that the pressure would lead to a quick capitulation. But Canada, guided by the system rather than personality, held its ground. And it didn't just hold its ground. The strategy of long-term stability began to work. A few days later, the story came to light for the first time thanks to an interview published in a Canadian publication. The journalist asked a simple question: why didn't you respond immediately? And the answer was simple and striking. A reaction under pressure is no longer a reaction, but manipulation. A country that lives by the rule of law cannot afford to make decisions dictated by emotions. What looked like diplomatic restraint turned out to be a carefully thought-out strategy. And then came the moment of public confrontation. In the Oval Office, in front of dozens of journalists and cameras, one country tried to turn the negotiations into a show, to portray Canada as weak, to laugh at its leader's accent and mannerisms. But instead of emotions and retaliatory remarks, there was silence. A short, concise phrase, 4 words, demonstrated the power of the strategy. The leader understood that arguing on someone else's stage, at someone else's pace, meant losing. The system does not respond to shouting. It acts through order, calculation, and institutional mechanisms. This was the result of weeks of preparation, consultations with partners around the world, multi-layered discussions, and the involvement of representatives from all sectors of society, from industry to education and environmental organizations. All this looked like a slowdown in the process, but in fact it was a strategy designed to neutralize pressure, and it began to yield results. The American side, accustomed to instant results, encountered for the first time a system that did not yield to personal tactics. This is not a story of loud words and threats. It is a story of how one person, acting through the system rather than through emotion, was able to change the international dynamic. This is a story about how, in the world of politics, silence is sometimes stronger than any shouting, and restraint is stronger than pressure. And this is a story about a country that for the first time began to act not as a neighbor, but as an independent player on the world stage. Today we will tell you all the details of that night when a single phone screen became the arena for a political clash between two eras, the era of instant pressure and the era of institutional calculation. You will see how the strategy of endurance rewrote the rules of the game, and why what seemed like weakness actually turned out to be a strength capable of changing the fate of an entire nation. The night was unusually quiet, almost serene, as most of the continent fell asleep, and only a few lights burned in the windows of government buildings. It seemed as if the whole world had stopped, but in fact something was happening that would change the course of history. Somewhere between Washington and Ottawa, a dialogue began that no one was supposed to see. On one end of the line was a leader accustomed to instant reactions, to the fact that his every word, every phone call could change the direction of negotiations or destroy established plans in a matter of minutes. On the other end was a man who had built his entire career on cool-headedness and precise calculations, on the ability to analyze the consequences of every action, where emotions and impulses played only a secondary role. The night began with several short messages sent late in the evening to his personal phone. The first ones were full of capital letters and direct threats: tariffs, sanctions, immediate fulfillment of conditions. These texts had nothing to do with diplomatic protocol. They were an attempt at psychological pressure designed to elicit an immediate response. But on the other end of the line, no one gave in. At 3 in the morning, at 7 in the morning, or even the next day, there was no response. It seemed that the system behind this person had completely neutralized the personal pressure. Behind the outward silence lay a careful strategy. Analysts calculated dozens of scenarios, assessed the consequences of each threat, and predicted the reaction of financial markets and industrial sectors. At that time, many on the New York Stock Exchange expected an immediate crisis, increased volatility, sharp fluctuations in automotive stocks, and disruptions in supply chains. But the Canadian side was ready, and its response was not only restrained, but also strategically calibrated. The first signs of preparation for this nighttime test appeared several weeks before the events. Canadian officials, having received unofficial signals about possible drastic actions on the part of Washington, held a series of closed meetings with European partners. The most incredible scenarios were discussed within the government, from the sudden introduction of tariffs on key industries to psychological pressure through media campaigns aimed at causing internal divisions and splitting the country's leadership team. At the same time, consultations were held with Japan and South Korea on the possible temporary redistribution of trade flows. It all looked like preparation for disaster, but in fact it was a carefully thought-out plan designed to neutralize pressure and show that the country was capable of acting independently. While negotiations continued at the official level within the usual protocols, nighttime messages created an atmosphere of tension, as if every keystroke on the phone could set off a chain of events on a global scale. The text sent to personal phones contained threats of immediate economic damage, open statements about the introduction of tariffs on all key export items, and even hints of possible diplomatic sanctions. Some of the messages were so aggressive that experts later admitted that they had never before seen such behavior at the level of intergovernmental relations, which is more characteristic of corporate manipulation than official diplomacy. Despite the pressure, the Canadian side not only did not respond, but also began to actively build internal coordination. Representatives of all key sectors participated in the discussions, from industrial enterprises to educational institutions, from trade unions to environmental organizations. This was not a decorative expansion of the team, as is sometimes done in public negotiations to create the appearance of inclusiveness. Each participation had a practical purpose: to assess risks, prepare response scenarios, find ways to minimize potential economic losses, and at the same time, maintain strategic autonomy. Behind closed doors, a real game was being played, where every word mattered. In some offices, alternative scenarios were even simulated. What would happen if the pressure intensified? If cyber attacks on financial infrastructure were added to the threats? If a media campaign were launched to discredit the country's leadership on the international stage? All these scenarios seemed incredible, almost like the plot of a political thriller, but in fact they were carefully checked and taken into account when making decisions. And while the global audience saw only formal press releases, inside the country, something was happening that would determine the future position of the state in global politics. It was at this moment that it became clear that traditional methods of pressure, personal threats, caps lock messages, psychological pressure, did not work on the system. The leader, accustomed to achieving results instantly, was confronted for the first time with the fact that there are state mechanisms that cannot be circumvented by personal force. The system, built up over decades, is capable of withstanding pressure, waiting it out, and making decisions only after a thorough analysis of all risks and consequences. This was a lesson not only for the individual participants in the events, but also for everyone who watched this clash. The night went on, messages followed one after another, but each new text was met with the same silence. The silence, which at first glance might have seemed like weakness, was in fact a powerful strategic tool. Within the country, every cabinet meeting, every consultation with experts and industry leaders strengthened the position, turning apparent inaction into strength. Outside observers, unaware of internal processes, assumed that the pressure was about to break the country. But behind the facade of calm, a carefully constructed system of defense was unfolding. In this story, the night became a symbol of the clash between two approaches: personal pressure and institutional power. A leader accustomed to instant results found that his methods did not work here. On the other side of the line, the system demonstrated that endurance and calculation can be more powerful than any threat. The night showed that the country's future may be determined not by the number of caps lock messages and personal ambitions, but by the strength of institutions, the ability to plan weeks ahead and make decisions that cannot be imposed through pressure. It was in the quiet of the night, amid closed-door meetings, text messages, and analytical reports, that it first became clear that the country was ready to act as an independent player, capable of withstanding pressure from a powerful neighbor while building its own strategic autonomy. It was a moment when personal charisma met institutional power, and this time, the power built on rules, calculations, and discipline prevailed. The night we talked about earlier gradually spilled over into the first days of public confrontation. What began as secret correspondence and scenario modeling has now turned into a real diplomatic game, where the stakes are much higher than anyone could have imagined. In early November, official news appeared that at first glance looked like a standard statement on trade agreements and tariffs. But behind this dry language lay a real crisis. The pressure on Canada was not only economic, but also psychological. The American side used all available channels to speed up the response. Messages were sent not only to personal phones, but also through intermediaries in diplomatic circles, and separate anonymous sources confirmed that even the possibility of temporarily blocking financial flows through large banks was discussed. When the situation became public, it became clear that the pressure had turned into a show. At one of the meetings held in Washington, the American side insisted on an open format with dozens of journalists and cameras. The entire hall turned into an arena, where Canada's attempts to defend its position looked like a slow, almost theatrical struggle with a loud opponent. The American leader joked, mocked, and talked about the 51st state in an attempt to force Canada to show weakness. But instead of engaging in an emotional dialogue, the Canadian side used the method we mentioned earlier: silence and restraint. Short, concise answers, a lack of emotional reaction, and complete disregard for provocations created the effect of the strength of the system against personal pressure. Behind the scenes, preparations for a possible escalation continued. In closed-door meetings, scenarios that seemed almost unbelievable were simulated: temporary shutdowns of key trade routes, the transfer of strategic resources in case of sanctions, and negotiations with allies around the world to create alternative supply chains. Some analysts admitted that this was the first time they had seen such detailed planning in the face of direct pressure from a more powerful neighbor. At the same time, work was carried out with internal sectors. Industry, education, ecology, and transport were all involved in creating multi-level protection, which outwardly looked like a slowdown in decision-making, but in fact allowed attempts at pressure to be neutralized and the country's position to be strengthened. These early days showed that public provocations and personal threats could be neutralized by institutional discipline.